Live from Liverpool, The Dark Paranormal, Season 19. Hello everyone and welcome back to The Dark Paranormal Season 19, Episode 5. We are already at the halfway point of the season, and as I always say, I genuinely can't believe it's come around this quickly already. It seems like literally yesterday I was putting together the promo for the launch of Season 19, and right now I'm going to ask you, as I do at the midpoint, to send in your submissions for Season 20. Season 20 is going to be a special season because, obviously, it's our 20th anniversary, if you will, in terms of seasons at least. And as ever, we're going to listen to your feedback and make some amendments for the better for Season 20. And we'll let you know about those in due course, but right now we need to focus on our midpoint episode for Season 19. Now, we've received some outstanding experiences for this season that have really stuck with me personally in terms of I've finished reading it and I've thought I can't wait to share that experience. And this is one of those. My ever paradoxical Irish grandmother, who wasn't a believer in the paranormal, would always get her house blessed when she moved home. And when asked why, she would say, "Some houses remember." And I've often thought about that particular remark because she would not have known about stone tape theory, for example. The idea that emotions can imprint themselves into the surrounding area and then be replayed at other times. And a few days after reading the story and thinking about what my nan used to say, I got thinking, I wonder if there are currently haunted houses of living people, i.e., a couple have moved into a house, they've had absolute emotional warfare within that home, and then they've moved. And somebody then moves into that house, and the house seems haunted. They see figures, reenactments, non-sentient hauntings of people who are still alive. Because as much as I've read on the topic, I can't see any rule within the stone tape theory that insists the energy that's placed into that area can only be put back out when the individual who put it in is dead. To make the rabbit hole stranger, imagine if you moved into a place with your partner, it was a bad relationship, really heated emotionally, then you left, but at some point in your life, you, alone, moved back into that place and were then haunted by your past self. Now, today's episode is not about that in particular. That's just me sharing where my rabbit hole brain took me this week. But it is about trauma and the effects that can have on a home, its environment, and the supernatural activity that may begin within. But before we reach today's amazingly creepy episode 5, we need to, of course, thank our wonderful team over at Patreon. When you choose to join our Patreon, not only will you receive everything on this main feed, both ad-free and before everyone else. So that's the main show, the minisodes, Dark Realms, and even the Dark Realms video. But you can also gain access to the full back catalogue of the Patreon-only podcast, Dark Bites. Dark Bites is out each and every Sunday of the year, even on the downtime between seasons. Which means not only do you never miss your paranormal weekly fix, you also have access to over 100 hours of listener stories which are too short for this main show. And it's not just early ad-free access to all 3 main feed shows and 100 hours worth of stories you won't have heard. You also become part of what I genuinely believe has evolved into the safest paranormal community anywhere online or anywhere else. And that's from 20 years experience of being nowhere but online forums for the paranormal. And that's 1% my doing and 99% the community themselves. We've built a wonderful community of paranormal enthusiasts over on Patreon, and we'd love to extend an exclusive invitation just for you. Head over to patreon.com/The Dark Paranormal. just like the following wonderful new team members have: Lee Radford, Charlie Lynn Cromwell, Brianna Beaton, Charlie Oakley, Jay Voca, Ryan, Emma Grover, Cursor Rhodes, Mario, Sherry Herring, Jennifer, Ghost Dog, Oksana, Travis Lay, Heather Bevers, Tosha Beckerman, Harvey Jeffries, Brett, Sarah, Miss Fiona, and Leon T. Thank you so much, guys. Literally, your support allows this show to sustain itself and keep growing and going. So if this sounds like your cup of tea, head over to patreon.com/The Dark Paranormal. But right now, for our halfway point of season 19, lower the lights, make yourself comfortable, and of course, leave your disbelief at the door, as we hear all about the Hilltop Haunting. Hi, I'm Jess, and I consider myself a skeptic, and not one for the woo stuff. Despite that, I am an avid listener of the show. I love stories about hauntings and the paranormal. This, I believe, is largely influenced by my childhood home. Because if you were to ask anyone in my family to set foot into it again, they would no doubt refuse. All of them. Even the offer of money to go back would not work. And most certainly they would not stay the night. But I've always felt strangely nostalgic for that house. It itches away at some part of my brain, desperate for closure, and a means to explain what happened there. My family refer to it as the house on the hill, aptly named for the fact that this old white farmhouse sits on one mound of a hill that raises it above the surrounding Michigan farmland, standing out like a sentinel over the rest of the land. The property butted up to an old peach orchard, one that had crispy, diseased trees that reminded me a bit of the apple trees in The Wizard of Oz with their gnarled branches. Below it was farmland that was in the beginnings of being developed into luxury homes that now house a lot of vacationing Chicago people for the summer. My father, my mother, my elder brother, 13, and I, aged 5, moved to the house with much excitement. I remember my parents saying that the landlord had told them it was the original owner's dream home, but it had since been divided into a duplex and then rented to us as a single-family home. This led to a very odd layout, where there was a kitchen and living room on both floors of the house. But it seemed bright and cheerful. The walls were all white, and there were many large windows that let the sun just flood right in. My mother quickly went to work to make it our home. She went room by room, painting the walls and the cupboards. My room was lavender. My brother's room was painted to look like a cloudy sky. She painted ivy in the kitchen. Because of this, the scent of fresh paint is something I've always associated with that house. But despite all of our excitement and the summer sunlight that filled the house, we very quickly started to feel some discomfort, especially on the second floor. It started just with a sense of unease. I recall not liking to be on the second floor alone, especially at night. I was often filled with a sense of dread at the top of the stairs. My parents' room was the living room to the right of the stairs, and I often would run past their door, afraid I would see something I shouldn't. They had a large picture window that faced the doorway, and at my young age, I was convinced that if I made eye contact with that at night, something besides my reflection would be looking back at me. Of course, these kinds of fears are typical in kids, especially kids the age I was. And fine if it was just me, but my brother and the adults felt it too. We even had a couple of my aunts and uncles remark they didn't like the upstairs. Upstairs is where the first odd events happened too. We had a little plaque that hung on the wall not far from the staircase. It had a short story on it about the symbolism of a dogwood blossom and the crucifixion. The crown of thorns in the centre, petals, dark spots representing the nails. My dad was the first to notice it. It wasn't near a light switch or on a wall where one could bump into it by accident. But even so, it would pendulum back and forth on the nail it hung from, often for surprisingly long periods of time, or until someone stopped it. My dad, David, would yell out, "Patty, come look, it's doing it again," swearing he didn't touch it. Around this time, my mum was also making a lot of New Age friends. I remember her going to drumming circles. She had friends that did Reiki. And not long after, she met a man they called Shaman Jim. He often led these drum circles and had quite a following in that community. She had spoken about feeling uneasy in the house, and some people in her circle recommended that she sage our home. It must have been very frequently because, looking back, it feels like my mother burnt sage almost daily. She also set up an altar on the first floor on her antique buffet cabinet. The top was covered in crystals and rocks. She'd placed a mirror on top that had feathers and beads draping from the edges. Around this time, she became very interested in a practice called journeying. She would meditate for long amounts of time and then come back with fantastic tales of the visions she'd had. She tried to introduce me to this practice as well, but I felt like it was closing my eyes and playing pretend. It just felt like I was improvising stories. But to her, it was visceral and very spiritual. Her father was part native, so I think it was her way of trying to connect to a culture her family had lost. During this same time, small things kept happening. On the second floor, the part that made us most uncomfortable was the hall outside of my brother's room. It was an L-shaped hall with green tile floor. One end opened to the upstairs kitchen. Now my room, which you could see straight through to my parents' room, and the stairs that led to downstairs. On the right side of the hall was my brother's room, and around the corner was the bathroom. A bathroom in that hall that stank frequently. And not of your typical bathroom smells, but rot. It always seemed to have flies buzzing around and smelled like a dead mouse or some other dead animal, though none were ever found despite multiple searches. My mum decided to shower in the upstairs bathroom one afternoon, likely after being covered in dirt from her job landscaping. She didn't like to be up there, but the other bathroom must have been in use by either my brother or my dad. She'd lathered up and had shampoo in her hair. She said she started to feel like something was watching her, like someone had come into the room. So she peeked around the curtain, but no one was there. So, tentatively, she goes back to lathering her hair and feels a hand on her shoulder. Startled, she smacked into the shower wall and stumbled to get out, her eyes burning with the soap. She ran blindly from the bathroom, the water still running. She ended up finishing her shower downstairs, and she never used that bathroom again. Sometime during all of this, I had my brief experience. I was downstairs in the dining room. I can't recall what I was doing. I was standing in front of my mum's altar on the buffet. I had a habit of just placing things wherever a flat surface was, and I'd left a book laying on the altar. As I stood looking at the rocks and mirror, the book began to move. It went from laying flat to standing on its spine whilst closed, and then slapping back down with some force. Immediately, I ran to my mum and told her what happened. My mum didn't try to calm me down, or tell me it was my imagination. She told me she had saw it move out of the corner of her eye, and she thought I threw it down. But seeing how worried I was, she definitely believed me. After a while, my brother started having nightmares. On one occasion, he had a sleep paralysis episode where he said that he awoke to that familiar feeling of being watched. He couldn't move, but he could look around, frozen in his bed. His eyes moved towards the doorway, and that's where he saw a large, dark figure with glowing red eyes staring back at him. This thing's unwavering gaze locked on him as it stood motionless in the doorway. He would later go on to admit as an adult that he did wet the bed during that experience. During this period where my mum was burning sage, my dad ended up opening the door to Jehovah's Witnesses. It started out with a few talks and a few books, the typical recruitment stuff they do. One day, a day that would lead to much contention in the house, a Jehovah's Witness saw my mum's altar. The man became noticeably uncomfortable and told my dad, "You need to get rid of that. It's a portal to hell." It was the last time he came by, but also the start of a lot of fights between my parents. My dad began calling Mum a witch, accusing her of inviting something into the home. My mum would push against him, seeing him as controlling and oppressive. From that point, things rapidly began to decline in their relationship. My parents began to fight constantly. The stress quickly led to drinking on both of their parts. We only lived in that house for a year, but in that short time, we would have the death of a dog, an entire litter of kittens, a cat, several birds which hit our windows, and eventually one of my mother's cousins. When that happened, my mum, my brother, and myself left for Arkansas, with my grandparents leaving my father alone for 2 weeks. During this time alone in the house, Dad headed to that stinking upstairs bathroom. He grabbed a change of clothes, went to the closet in the upstairs kitchen to grab a belt, walked all the way down the L-shaped hall round the corner. Socks. He'd forgotten socks. He turned back round the corner, and a wire hanger whipped through the air at head height, causing him to duck out of the way. He was shook. The closet the hanger had flown from was over 30 feet away. He'd been at that closet and had to walk through several rooms before turning round to head back, which was when it was launched at him. He tried to reason that it perhaps happened when he grabbed his belt, but couldn't figure out how or why it would be so delayed. So he too ended up in the downstairs bathroom. About a week into our trip, my mum called home. Dad talked to us on the phone, and I can remember him seeming rather anxious to have us back. He didn't say why or what had happened. I thought he just missed us. When we returned, it was apparent that he'd been sleeping in the downstairs living room. All of his bedding and pillows were there. I don't think I've ever seen my dad so happy to see us since that day. He told us about the hanger. but also said that wasn't why he was sleeping downstairs. What had him sleeping downstairs with the dog was something that happened right before he called us. A week after we left, my dad had returned home from working at his second shift job. It was late and it was a 12-hour shift. He bathed downstairs and made his way upstairs to go to bed, exhausted from a day at the foundry. He clicked the light on at the top of the stairs, and his eye was immediately drawn to the dark shape in the middle of the upstairs kitchen. It was a rocking horse, one my parents had gotten me. A black horse with red rockers, turned upside down, balanced on its head, with his rockers perpendicular to the ground. He believed whatever was in the house did not like him, and he did not want to go back upstairs alone. This next event would be the final one to take place in the house. Afterwards, all paranormal activities ceased, outside of feeling watched. My mother, still defiant and burning sage, mentioned she'd spoke of our house to her friend Shaman Jim. At this point, he wasn't just a friend, but a mentor. She had been practicing shamanism for quite a while under his tutelage. He would often tell her that she had to be a sieve, that people who had gifts for healing also often had the gift of great empathy, but it could also turn on them if they didn't allow it to pass through them. My mother is definitely someone who holds on to things. She's never been a person to let things go. Even when the hurt is someone else's, she'll carry their grudge for them. She'll let her heart break on someone else's behalf. One evening, she had Jim over to the house, doing whatever it is they did, journeying, sage burning, or the like, and she went to her altar where her crystals and sage rested. Jim stood next to her. As her eyes went up to the mirror, she said it was like the breath was pulled from her lungs. She stood locked in on a face that was her own, but also wasn't. The hair was darker, the eyes devoid of any light. An angry scowl rested on its face. It was a stranger looking back. Even Shaman Jim took a step back away from my mother and her reflection. My mum's focus shifted to Jim in the mirror. Just as quickly as she was there, the other was gone. Before my mother could even say anything, Shaman Jim answered, "I saw her too." Moments later, Shaman Jim ended up needing to leave, as he seemed quite shaken, leaving my mum all alone. She said that she felt an overwhelming sense of grief and emptiness. The happenings may have ended there for us, but for my mum, well, she couldn't let it go. She would later say that she had seen the woman in a journey. That same feeling of the wind being knocked out of her as they locked eyes. Shaman Jim would later tell her that she brought something back from the other world. But she didn't just bring it back. She named it, called her Jalhala, and very quickly she spiraled. She soon tried hard drugs, lost her job. My parents began to physically fight. We kept moving, and I was between 7 schools in the 4 years that followed. Later, she would say things like, "That bitch did this to me." We knew she meant the one in the mirror. Sometime later, she would also try to end her own life. She said it was like when she saw her, it knocked all of the joy and will to live out of her that she had. she said that she'd been followed by her and that she never left. My mother even painted a picture of her. Today, 25 years later, Jalhala's face is on a brick, background of black, with flames and bloodshot eyes floating around in some junk pile in my parents' garage or maybe a closet. My mother views her as the spiritual embodiment of addiction. A very quick Google search and you'll find that it isn't a real word or a real name. However, interestingly, it is very close to the Urdu word jaljala, which has several meanings including to set into a state of violent motion, an earthquake. That time in my life truly did feel earth-shaking and violent. Now, I began this story saying I don't believe in the supernatural. And that's true, I don't. I'm an atheist and a skeptic. I think the whole haunting was a combination of my father's religious beliefs, causing hysteria, and mother's drug abuse, as well as mental illness. Though I do believe in sleep paralysis and the impressionable minds of kids. I've been in many haunted places since, and find people's fear almost laughable, despite once feeling that very fear myself. However, I also know I didn't lie very much as a child. This is something that unsettles me to this day. I was odd, blunt. Frankly, I thought kids my age were stupid for having imaginary friends. I played pretend with an awareness of how fake it was. Therefore, I tended to gravitate towards adults or older kids. The best I can think is that the book floating was a false memory or a trick of the mind. Because that memory still feels very real. And I don't believe I told a lie. It felt honest then, and it feels honest now. Out of everyone in my family, I am the only one that would go back to that house on the hill. Because even with my rational mind, there is still a sliver of me that wants to go back to prove nothing is there. To almost poke it with a stick and say, look, no ghosts or demons here, only haunted, traumatized people. The house is still standing, though it's been totally gutted and remodeled. Everything has been modernized. I looked up the address recently and saw that most of the upstairs, it's hardly recognizable to me. But the downstairs is fairly untouched outside of the kitchen. Sometimes I wish I could go up and knock and ask the people living there if they feel uneasy upstairs at night. If you would like to see the house, Jess then provides me with the address of the house, which I legally can't read out in a podcast for the general public. And with that, Jess signs off her email. Now, I have looked on Google Earth, etc. for the house, and there is something about the house, I will not lie. I don't want to talk too much about it, both for privacy reasons and also because I don't think it's too fair to tell you the full narrative of that experience and not give you guys the opportunity to see that house. But Jess, sincerely thank you for providing an intriguing episode for our midpoint journey through season 19. This one really had me thinking, like I said at the start, and especially emails that come in from skeptical people. People who literally end their experience by saying, I wish I could go back to poke a stick at the alleged spirits and prove they don't exist. But as you say, trauma and haunted people certainly do. just not necessarily in the standard haunted sense? And do they leave some indelible mark on that house? Or was it always there to begin with? Because you do mention it was shortly after moving in that these things started happening. Although, 2 points I do want to point out. Firstly, I really like shaman or shaman, English and American versions of the word there. I like his explanation of how he told your mother to act like a sieve, in terms of to let these emotions, especially if she's an empathetic person, pass through her. That, again, like I've said often recently, is an idea in terms of how paranormal activity can begin that I've never heard before. And secondly, and I don't know if any of you guys picked up on it, but there was a mention of sleep paralysis and a red-eyed being. Now, I genuinely can't remember if it was a full episode of The Dark Paranormal, a mini-sode, or an episode of Dark Bites, but we did have a story that featured red-eyed kids, as opposed to black-eyed kids. The difference between the two seeming to be that these red-eyed kids would follow you into your dreams, and then you would awake paralyzed to find that they'd followed you into the waking state, and they would be in your room. So Jess, it would be interesting to know if your brother, when he woke with sleep paralysis and saw this figure with red eyes, if that same figure was in his dream prior to waking up. And if you do have that conversation, please let me know so I can pass that on to our wonderful listeners. And to our wonderful listeners, thank you so much for joining me once again for your show, The Dark Paranormal. Don't forget, for early ad-free content and over 100 hours worth of unheard stories, head over to patreon.com/The Dark Paranormal. But until next time, remember, when you're discussing the paranormal, always try and leave some of your disbelief at the door. And I'll see you next week, right here on The Dark Paranormal.